In the opening chapters of Jane Eyre, we meet a young girl trapped in a world of cruelty at Gateshead Hall. Jane faces the harsh treatment of her aunt, Mrs. Reed, and her cousins, particularly John, who bullies her relentlessly. After a confrontation, she's locked in the terrifying Red Room, a place that symbolizes her isolation and fear. But hope arrives when Mr. Lloyd, the apothecary, intervenes, leading to Jane's escape to Lowood School. There, she meets Helen Burns, who teaches her the power of patience and forgiveness, contrasting with Jane's fiery spirit. Mr. Brocklehurst's humiliating treatment of Jane only strengthens her resolve, and with Miss Temple's support, she finds her voice and begins to forge her identity. These early chapters set the stage for Jane's journey of resilience and self-discovery, highlighting themes of injustice and the importance of friendship. Where is Jane Eyre at the beginning of the story? Jane is at Gateshead Hall, the home of her aunt, Mrs. Reed. How does Mrs. Reed treat Jane? Mrs. Reed treats Jane unfairly, showing favoritism toward her own children and often punishing Jane harshly. Why is Jane sent to the Red Room? Jane is accused of being violent toward her cousin John Reed after he hits her. As punishment, she is locked in the Red Room, where Mr. Reed died. How does Jane feel in the Red Room? Jane is terrified and feels abandoned. She believes she sees a ghostly presence, which causes her to panic. Who comes to check on Jane in the Red Room? Bessie and Miss Abbott come to check on Jane. How does Jane respond to being accused of being a bad child? Jane defends herself, arguing that she is treated unfairly and that John Reed is the real bully. What decision does Mrs. Reed make about Jane's future? Mrs. Reed decides to send Jane away to Lowood School, a charity institution for orphans. Who is Mr. Lloyd, and how does he help Jane? Mr. Lloyd is the family's apothecary. He listens to Jane's concerns and suggests sending her to school, which leads to the decision to send her to Lowood. How does Jane feel about leaving Gateshead? Jane is relieved and hopeful to leave Gateshead, where she has suffered so much neglect and mistreatment. Who is Mr. Brocklehurst, and what is his role in Jane's life? Mr. Brocklehurst is the headmaster of Lowood School. He visits Gateshead to arrange Jane's admission to the school. How does Mrs. Reed describe Jane to Mr. Brocklehurst? Mrs. Reed describes Jane as deceitful and warns Mr. Brocklehurst to be cautious of her behavior. How does Jane confront Mrs. Reed before leaving Gateshead? Jane boldly tells Mrs. Reed that she is cruel and unjust and that she will never call her aunt again. What are Jane's first impressions of Lowood School? Jane finds the school austere and cold, with strict discipline and poor living conditions. Who becomes Jane's first friend at Lowood? Helen Burns becomes Jane's first friend at Lowood. What is Helen Burns's attitude toward punishment? Helen is patient and forgiving. She believes in enduring hardship and responding to cruelty with kindness and humility. How does Helen's attitude differ from Jane's? Jane believes in standing up for herself and fighting injustice, while Helen is more passive and accepting of her circumstances. How does Mr. Brocklehurst publicly humiliate Jane? Mr. Brocklehurst forces Jane to stand on a stool and tells the school that she is a liar, instructing the other girls to avoid her. How does Helen support Jane during this humiliation? Helen smiles at Jane and quietly reassures her, showing her silent support and friendship. What does Miss Temple do to clear Jane's name? Miss Temple writes to Mr. Lloyd, who confirms Jane's account of her childhood, proving her innocence. How does Jane's reputation change after Miss Temple's intervention? Jane is vindicated, and the other girls begin to treat her more kindly. How does Jane's friendship with Helen and Miss Temple influence her character? Their kindness and wisdom help Jane develop resilience, strength, and a sense of justice.